How much downhill is too much downhill? If you're anything like me, you've succumbed to the peer pressure and you're running the 2024 Revel White Mountain Marathon. It's a downhill marathon that runs along the course of the Kancamagus Highway, and it is a Boston qualifier, and it could possibly be your marathon PR. Or is it? It's really hard to say unless you take a look at the data associated with the elevation chart of the Revel White Mountain Marathon, and you compare it to something that you know. Do you know what kind of decline you are comfortable with? When is a decline not comfortable anymore? Can we take samples of courses that we know already, that we run today? And can we take samples of courses that maybe you're familiar with that other people aren't? And can you look at that data to make an empirical decision? This course is going to be a barn burner, or this course is really going to destroy my quads. Let's take a look. Okay, we have some comparisons here that we're going to make on the Revel White Mountain Marathon against Green River, a common course that we find in Central Mass Striders, a common course we find in Highland City Striders, and a common course we find with Tri-State Running. Between the three of these, you should have a pretty good idea of being able to go into Strava in this case and be able to identify specific places on the courses that are have a specific decline percentage and be able to decide whether you're comfortable with that percentage or not, and then compare it to the Revel White Mountain course. And as we can see here, we have the Revel White Mountain course on my screen right now, and I'm going to show you a 3D rendering of that course. This is what that course looks like in 3 dimensions, and as you can see here, the first 4 miles of that course are a fairly significant amount of downhill, and that decline percentage is roughly in the 5 to 6%. What does 5 to 6% look like? Well, let's take the run that I did today. Central Mass Striders' very popular run is the Rutland Rail Trail. I ran the Rutland Rail Trail from the Glenwood side to the Barre side and back. And there's 2 data points that I'd like to show you in that run. This is what the course looks like in Strava. This is the Glenwood side over here on the east, and over to the west is the Barre side. And there's 2 places in particular that I want to focus in on. We're going to look at it in the 3D map. One area right here is at about a mile in, you go underneath a bridge. After you go underneath the bridge, you take a sharp right out of that bridge onto asphalt, and you're on the street at that point. And you go down a hill before you re-meet back into the Central Mass Rail Trail again. That is a place in the rail trail that has a pretty significant decline percentage. Actually, it's about 6%. Let's take a look at it on the map. This is the entirety of the run for the Rutland Rail Trail. It starts up at Glenwood, goes all the way downhill to Barre, and then all the way back up again. What does 6% look like? About 2 miles into this course, I'm going to highlight it here, you go underneath a bridge, which of course you can't see here in a 3D rendering, and you take a sharp right-hand turn out of the rail trail onto Miles Road. And then you go down this hill. This hill is about a 6% decline. If I mouse over it here, you'll see I get about -5, -7, somewhere around there, 5.6. But the point is it's around 6%. Now, to me personally, when I'm going down this part of the road, it's uncomfortable. It's not something where I can let go or be free. I'm actually kind of hitting the brakes a little bit. So to me, 6% is a little heavy. But I guess if it kept going, I would be able to find a way to manage it. Well, that's good because it's the first 4 miles of the Revel White Mountain course. Now, there's another place in the Rutland Rail Trail that's very interesting to me because it answers the question, what do I find comfortable in terms of a decline percentage? And that's going to be right before the switchbacks. If I look at this course, see at the very end down here, we have these switchbacks. So this is where, since it's so steep, they decided on the rail trail to cut it back and forth like a sidewinder. And that's this section right here, and I'm going to highlight it. And you can see it in more detail. So this is the sidewinder right here. I'm not really talking about that. That's around a 5.5%. And if you've ever run it, you know you're going around a tight corner, you're hitting rocks and stuff like that. It's very difficult. People with their unleashed dogs and everything. And it is quite difficult. I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about this section right here. I'm eating a Pop-Tart. So what? Shut up. I run sub 3-hour marathons. This section right here is about a 3% downgrade. So if I go over that section, the beginning of the downhill, I get somewhere around -3%, kind of crests up at about -4%. I feel like I can let go on this section though. So if you gave me a race that was a -3%, I would feel like I could go all day. Could I really go all day? Probably not, but I feel really good going down this. You may be asking yourself, well, the entirety of the rail trail, that's got to be like a 1%, right? And you'd be about right. That's about where the rail trail floats. Both the Rutland Rail Trail and the Holden Rail Trail down to West Boylston float around a -1% when you're going from uphill to downhill. So those are 2 data points for Central Mass Striders runners right there. Okay, so if we take a look back at the White Mountain Marathon 3D chart and we ignore the first 4 miles, what about the rest of it? The only thing really of note in here is that they had to put a small out and back in the middle of the course to make the 26.2. And when they did that, that's going to include a little bit of a hill for about 1.5 miles. That hill is usually running around 2%, 3%, and then downhill the rest of the way. What does downhill the rest of the way really mean? Other than the first 4 miles, other than that 1.5 miles, when you do the out and back, you're looking at generally anywhere in the 2 to 3% range, especially once you start getting past mile 17. It starts getting a little bit more in the 3% range. What was it at Green River? Now, if you ran Green River, you knew it was kind of miserable. That was more like a 5%, but the problem with that was it was a lot of dips and flats, dips and flats, dips and flats. So every time you started to get comfortable running a flat, you got another dip again, and that made that very difficult. It doesn't look like Kangamangas has as much of that. Well, what about Highland City Striders and Tri-State running? Let's take a look at Highland City Striders by looking at the 10-mile Laborious course. Now, of course, this course is something that is, it's a course that's actually run a couple of times a year, and it features the dreaded Hosmer Hill. Now, if you look at the end of the Hosmer Hill, when you get to the very top, you go up 2 hills in Hosmer, and then at the top of that hill, you start going down at a very consistent rate. And so that's a pretty good data point. What percentage does that look like? And so we can grab the top of the Hosmer Hill to the bottom and take a closer look at it. So this is that. You get to the top of the hill, and then you start kind of cruising down that hill. What does that look like? When we look up here, it's about 5%. That's not bad. Now, I can burn down this hill, but it's kind of freewheeling, like my arms are up and I'm flailing about and so on. So I can't really say I'm terribly controlled at 5%, but in this case, I know it's the end of the race. So I know I can put a little bit more gas into it. So I feel comfortable if I have a lot of energy and it's a 5%. If I don't have a lot of energy, I feel more comfortable with a 3%. Okay, now let's take a look at Tri-State running. This is using a very common course that they run at TSR. It starts at the Planet Fitness in Webster, and it goes right out to the intersection, the big intersection with a Price Chopper, a gas station with a Dunkin' Donuts, and we turn left. We then turn left at the cemetery. We kind of follow the contour of the cemetery, come back out on Route 12 again. And then a little bit further down Route 12, we do another veer off onto Linwood Street, which is just a really small offshoot street that joins right back up with Route 12 again. But it's an interesting piece of that course. About 2 miles in, and I'm going to take a look at it here in the 3D view. If we take a really close look at that specific part of the course, you'll see here that we're running down Route 12, and that's what this is right here, and it's nice and flat. And then we veer off into Linwood, and it's still flat, still flat. Then all of a sudden, we hit this downhill. It's a pretty decent downhill. What does that feel like? So the next time you're running down Linwood and you're joining back with Route 12 again, you're going to notice you're on a downhill. You can say to yourself with some certainty that that is around 3.5% downhill. And so that is a good way to gauge how you feel on that 3.5%. Okay, because when you run Revel is going to be a lot of 3.5s and 4s and 2.5s. So knowing what it feels like is going to be very, very important. So, in conclusion, you want to get a good understanding of what you consider to be a comfortable decline percentage over a long distance. And the best way to do that is to take your own running courses, go into Strava, and take a look at your elevation charts and mouse over them. Oh, at that part of the course, Strava's pretty good about showing a dot on the screen when you're mousing over the elevation chart. It doesn't do it the other way around, but at least you can do this from the elevation chart. You can look at it and say, okay, I know this part of the course was fairly uncomfortable and it was a -8%. Got it. And that hopefully will help you feel a little bit more comfortable about your chances of getting that marathon PR at Revel Mountain. I hope you enjoyed the video, and we'll see you next time.